Hey, Gwinnett.
How are you?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
Did you learn a lot setting up a webinar?
Oh, I think
How are you?
I'm doing fine, thank you. I think I have. I hope I did it right. We're going to see. Talk a little shop real quick. Well, it's just you and I. So we had the put the Maloney Pines video live. We put it public today for the first time and have already almost doubled the amount of views that we had. So that was very good.
Oh, that's great news.
Yeah. So,
Very good.
yeah. So I'm very happy about that.
Yes, I am too.
Hey, Graham.
Hello, everybody. Anybody hear me?
Yep.
Glenn, can you hear me? Okay, you're on mute, I guess. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm not hearing you though.
Oh,
I'm probably gonna have to get some headphones. Hold on. Let me just see if this is. Okay, can I hear you now?
Let's see. Can you
Not
hear me?
yet. How about now? Can you hear me?
I can
Lynette?
hear you. Yes, I
Okay,
hear
now I
you.
can, okay, I'm good.
Okay,
I can hear you now. That's good. So,
good.
fantastic. Now, are you going to make me a co-host or
I don't
somebody?
have control. I think John does.
John, are you
Um,
there?
Yep, I
Can
just
you?
did.
Okay, great. And are am I going to do this spotlighting again, or are we just going to keep it open?
I
Uh,
don't think
we'll just
do
keep
we?
it like all six of us because we can. It's a webinar.
Yeah, I think we'll just keep all six of us. It's a webinar.
Okay. I've got a few slides to share, which I'll do uh, when we get to that part. But I might.
and as soon as I turn it over to you, Graham, I will disappear. I'll turn my camera off.
Okay. Sounds good. It looks like we're already live on YouTube, which is exciting.
Nice to be a star, right?
Yeah. Okay. Can you see that screen now?
Yes,
Okay. Great.
yes.
And then I'm going to test one other thing. Okay. You should see a Google page now. Can you see a Google page now?
I do.
Okay. Great.
Hello, Graham.
Hi, Larry. How are you?
I'm good. Hello, Uncle Lynette.
Hi, Larry.
You and Joe hanging out in different parts of the house.
We are.
Is he coming tonight?
He is. Yeah, we both enjoyed the first part, so looking forward to this evening.
Martha just watched it for the first time this afternoon.
Oh, so she's going to get a double dose today?
Well, now she's on a Zoom call with her college buddies. So, we'll watch it in due time. But anyway. It was an interesting couple hours. Graham, there was another Bullock on the call. Who was that?
That was my mother.
So where's your
yeah.
mother reside?
She's in Atlanta, in Decatur, Georgia. So, yeah, and my dad was on too, I think. So,
Okay.
yeah, and they may be on now too. So I think we're live on YouTube, and then we've got 16 participants already in the Zoom. So we've got a good start.
Good.
So hello, everyone out there, if you're watching. There's Robert.
I see where Peter's advertising his program Tuesday night. Very creative, Peter.
Don't you have anything to advertise, Larry?
No, not a thing.
I had to cut my crop walk short to make sure I got here on time tonight.
Were you walking in the rain?
Well, I got back before it really started raining. I'm afraid the rest of them are out there in the middle of it. But they should be back shortly if they're not already. It's actually, I don't think it's raining right this second.
It's 7 o'clock. Shall we start, John?
Yeah.
All right. I'd like to welcome you to part 2 of the Pastoral Perspectives on Political Polarization. It's quite a mouthful, but the first session was wonderful, and I'm looking forward to the session this evening. I'm Glenette Popovich. I'm the chair of the Adult Ministry Committee at the Davidson College Presbyterian Church, and I want to welcome you to the webinar, or if you're watching on YouTube Live. Either way, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to use the chat function if you're on the webinar, and the comments section if you're on YouTube Live. Those questions will get transferred into the participants. I'd like to introduce the panelists this evening. We have Reverend Dr. Peter Henry, pastor of the Davidson College Presbyterian Church. We have Reverend Robert Alexander, associate pastor for discipleship and mission. Reverend Claire George Drumheller, associate pastor for campus ministry. Reverend Dr. Larry Lyon, staff associate for senior adult ministry. And the Reverend Dr. John Ryan, associate pastor for faith formation. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Graham Bullock. He is the Associate Professor of Political Science and Faculty Director of the Deliberative Citizenship Initiative at Davidson College. Graham grew up in Washington, D.C., received his undergraduate degree from Princeton University, a master's in public policy from Harvard, and his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. Graham is married, Molly, in the Health and Human Values Department at Davidson College. They have 2 children, Jordan and Asher. Graham?
Thanks so much, Glenette, and I'm glad to be here again tonight with such a distinguished panel of pastors from DCPC. And the plan for tonight is to build on our wonderful conversation from our first Pastors Forum and continue that discussion. First, we'll cover some of the questions that we didn't quite get to in that last session, some from audience members, and then one that we had kind of kept in reserve if we had more time, and we have more time tonight. And then I've been asked by the pastors to talk a little bit about what we can do, both at an individual level and also as a community on difficult conversations. If we, from these forums, have the energy and inspiration to try to engage with some of our friends and family on some of these topics that are difficult but important. I've got a few ideas to share from my work with the Deliberative Citizenship Initiative. And then we'll have some time at the end for questions and answers from me and from the panelists. And so that's the plan for today, and I'm really looking forward to it. So the first question that was a leftover from last time was, about all of your sort of general faith and Reformed and insights from the Reformed tradition specifically. So what insights from the Reformed tradition and your faith more generally do you believe are most relevant to navigating these difficult conversations as engaged Christians? And I'd like to start with John because I know I missed your hand a couple times last time, John. So I want to give you, first shot at the first question. So please jump in.
We got that because I whined to Graham about him. So, when I think about the Reformed tradition, and maybe I'm gonna take the easy way out here, but I'm gonna go with the sovereignty of God, because ultimately I have to believe that in everything that God is ultimately in control. And even in the darkest of times, when there doesn't seem to be a lot of hope, I have to believe that God is indeed present with us and active in ways that we don't always see God at work. And though it's not always easy, but it's still our call as Christians to be present and to be still engaged and to continue to do work. And when I think about that, I also think of Teresa of Avila, who wrote a poem that Christ has no body now but yours, and no hands and no feet. And even though we're not always cognizant of how things are working, that we still have to continue to work for good and work to see the good that God has planned for us to be there.
Great, thanks, John. Thanks for starting us off. And I'd like to turn now to Claire. Claire, you had a lot of great ideas from our individual conversation that I think people would love to hear.
Sure, yeah. Well, I will start with an article that was written for the Presbyterian Outlook magazine a number of years ago by a friend and mentor of mine named George Anderson. And he wrote this article that the role of a pastor is twofold. There's the saint, and then there's the sage. And the sage plays a bit of the role of prophet, speaking truth to power, calling the people back to God to confess our sins, naming injustices and calling the people to focus on working for God's kingdom and bringing about God's justice on earth. And then the role of the sage is very much like what John's poem was just talking about, reminding us that we are the body of Christ, calling us to unity, calling us to love, to be in community around God's table, remembering those vows we took at baptism. So really focusing on that union of Christian sisters, brothers, and siblings. And so this article is saying that pastors tend to lean one way or lean the other. And so the challenge is to figure out when it's time to play the saint and when it's time to play the sage. And I would argue that even applies larger to pastors, to the Christian disciple, to figure out when is it the time to have that prophetic voice and speak truth to power, and when is it time to focus on reconciliation and unity. That's a big challenge. I certainly have one way that I lean, and when I recognize the need to lean the other way, and it is a challenge for me. And one of the things that helps me remember to play both the saint and the sage is the Presbyterian idea of mutual forbearance. It's one of those lofty phrases that we love to throw around. And in our book of order, so in our Presbyterian Constitution, we start, before we get to the rules, the thou shalls and the thou shalt nots, we start with the foundations. So the very first sentence says, Christ alone is the head of the church. What are the things we have to theologically name blatantly before we can go into the nuts and bolts of how we are the church? And mutual forbearance is in that foundations chapter. It basically says we agree to disagree, and that's okay, that we can agree on the essentials and disagree on some other things. That's a lot harder. It's easier to say than it is to practice. But for me, that practice means I have received a lot of grace, and therefore I am to show a lot of grace, especially when in conversations or in community with people who I don't completely agree with.
Sorry, I was muted again. Thanks so much for that, Claire. Those are some great ideas that maybe we can come back to later. But I'd like to turn now to Robert. What insights for you are most relevant here from the Reformed tradition and Presbyterianism, more specifically, perhaps?
Claire mentioned reconciliation, and that is a call to us as Christ is reconciling humanity to God. We are called to participate in that. And that's, as she said, not always easy. And I think it helps for us to remember, one, that we believe that we're all created in God's image. And so we look to each other and recognize the light of God's presence and love within each individual, even though we may disagree with them or think that they're way off the mark. We are to look for God's image and for the Christ in each individual, and also to acknowledge and recognize that we are all broken people, that that sin is a reality in our world, and that it creates havoc in our lives and in our relationships and in our communities, and that forgiveness and healing are needed by the grace of God. And so I think in order for reconciliation to be a reality and a possibility, we have to acknowledge both the light of God's presence and the reality of sin and brokenness, and work together to see that within ourselves, to acknowledge that, and to be really careful about trying to recognize one over the other in another individual. As we have been talking about the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes in the recent weeks in church, one of the things we focused on is the act of peacemaking and the importance of being peacemakers. We believe in our tradition in the priesthood of all believers. And so we believe that we have gifts and a calling to work as God's people in the world. And two of those important roles for me are ambassadors of reconciliation and makers of peace, peacemakers in the world. So.
Great. Thanks so much, Robert. That's fantastic. Now I want to turn to Larry. Larry, what insights do you find most relevant here?
Well, I like to think that I'm a big fan of the Reformed tradition and have been appropriately inoculated into the Reformed tradition. I also am a big fan of something called the PCUSA Brief Statement of Faith, probably because it has the word brief in it, and I really love brief. Some of the confessions are not that way. And it is a Trinitarian statement in which it makes statements about God, Jesus Christ, and God, the Holy Spirit. And in each of the three sections about each of those things, it begins with the words "we trust," as in we trust Jesus Christ, we trust in God, and we trust in God the Holy Spirit, which goes back to me to what John said, is the sovereignty of God. If you're old enough to remember what a coin looks like, as I am, coins have all but disappeared. But on those coins, the last time I checked it, it says "in God we trust." And too often we act like we don't trust in God. We give into our fears every day. We build the greatest military in the history of the world. We carry guns into public places. We pray that political leaders, people we elect on November 3rd, or Supreme Court justices, they will save us. What we forget is that we are not the gods. G-O-D-S. Our political leaders are not the gods. We are, again, for simplicity's sake, we are gods, G-O-D apostrophe S. We belong to God. God does not belong to us. And I believe that God is a loving, a great, and a good God. And that we ought to live in that blessed assurance that that God is still in control. Also in the brief statement of faith, there's a wonderful sentence, which despite being written 37 years ago, I think really speaks to 2020. And that sentence says, in a broken and fearful world, the Spirit gives us courage to pray without ceasing, to unmask idolatries. And I'm going to make the argument that safety has become an idol in this country, to unmask idolatries in church and culture, to hear the voices of people long silenced, and to work with others for justice, freedom, and peace. I try every day to choose my faith over my fears. I'm not a big guy. My fears scare me. As scary as I want to be, I started yesterday to watch the Netflix show, The Haunting of Bly Manor. That is about as scared as I want to be. I seek for my faith to inform what I say and what I do. And I fail every day, but I try again the next morning to choose faith over my fear, a faith in a loving God that I seek to trust.
Great. Thanks, Larry. That's great. Love to hear the actual quotations, from some of those documents in the Reformed tradition. But now I want to turn to, last but not least, Peter. What speaks to you from those documents, or from just the sort of orientation of the Reformed tradition in this context?
Thank you, Graham. I appreciated Claire mentioning the foundation section from the Book of Order, which talks about some of the hallmarks or elements of our Reformed tradition. And among the hallmarks or elements of our tradition that are lifted up are, number one, that we're the Church Reformed, always reforming, which means that we need to have a certain amount of humility in regards to our positions and the way we address what we understand to be the truth of the world. As Claire mentioned the last time we talked, the folks who wrote the Scots Confession thought they had it all right. And we know now that there are a lot of statements in that confession, in our Book of Confessions, that we would not go near with a 10-foot pole. And we understand that because we're the Church Reformed, always reforming. And an element of that is stated differently, that we say one of the hallmarks of our Reformed tradition is that we recognize the human tendency to idolatry. So in my conversation, am I making my position and some of the things that I'm saying their own form of idols? Am I coming to worship how I've conceived of things and how I view things in a way that's not healthy or holy? So humility and the recognition of our tendency to idolatry are certainly elements of our Reformed tradition. And then a word that used to be really commonplace among Presbyterians is the word covenant, that we've made commitments to one another, a commitment that we make with other people and with God in the presence of God. And in that covenant, we've said we are together. And that means that we're going to be willing to work through and see the connections we have beyond the differences that we experience. And Graham, I also, in addition to the Reformed tradition, I'm a big fan of an NPR show called On Being, hosted by Krista Tippett. She has a section and a part of their program that's on civil conversations, and they talk about grounding virtues. And among their grounding virtues are humility and generous listening, which I think correspond to part of what I just lifted up from our Reformed tradition. So again, that's Krista Tippett, the Civil Conversations Project, and On Being.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks for all of that, and the reference to On Being is really great. She has a concept as well that I think is relevant. We'll come to maybe later, of robust or muscular civility, which means being civil, but not shying away from disagreement, and really engaging authentically and deeply with your conversation partner. And she shows how that is done in all of her interviews and her work. So we'll talk maybe a little bit about that in a few minutes and have some examples of it, perhaps. But now I want to turn to some questions that were raised at the last session, and maybe you can call on some of the references you made already to mutual forbearance or saints and sages, et cetera, which I think are all really helpful. So the first question is DCPC a safe environment for those with views outside the norm? And not all of you have to answer all of these, right? Just as you feel called. And I have whoever wants to kind of jump in on this question, maybe just raise your hand.
Graham, I'd be curious to have John take a first stab at that. John often is not at the center of conversations, but as our adult faith formation staff member, is often in connection with the folks who are centering, grounding, leading the various adult faith formation conversations. And he might have a particular perspective from that vantage point.
Great.
My hope would be yes. But I wonder for those that have a view that is way outside of the norm of DCPC, if they do feel like they can really express their views and feel that they are really accepted and feel that they're not going to be judged or be talked about. I'm not always sure. I think I would hope from the leadership that we all create an accepting place, but I'm not always sure.
Graham, while others think, I'll just share with you, I sat down in August for about an hour, 15 minutes with one of our church members on the Congregation House porch, gave me a manila file folder with a bunch of things he thought I should read. And somewhere in there said something like, some of these are things that I don't think people at DCPC would want me to share in our studies and our conversations. And I actually owe him a follow-up sit down. I made a commitment that I would read those and that we would engage on the other side of my reading. That's an anecdote, doesn't speak to everybody, but that was at least one person who said, I'm not sure I find it totally safe at every point to share some of my thoughts and views.
Yeah, well, maybe towards the end of our conversation today, we can talk about ways in which we can make it feel safer, while also thinking about boundaries, and ways to communicate those boundaries. That's something that we're thinking a lot about with the Deliberative Citizenship Initiative. Bridges and boundaries, welcoming people in, but also having some definition of what is sort of helpful language and tone and topics. So anyone else want to take a crack on that question, or should we? Okay, Robert, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. I think it's really natural for all of us to have blind spots, and it's really hard to know where those are if someone doesn't help you to see them. And so whether or not I agree or don't agree with someone, I don't ever want to be saying or doing things that make people feel like they cannot express themselves or be free to, approach me to have a conversation. And I would hope that if I said or did things as an individual, that someone would come and have a conversation with me in a spirit of love. In the same way, I would hope that in our congregation, that people would feel free to come and say, I think this is an area where we are keeping people from being free to be themselves, or I mean, obviously there are things that are not consistent with what I would consider, the truth of Christian faith. But in terms of, I mean, we've got a pretty big tent and umbrella, I would like to believe. But again, there are blind spots. And if people are able to have those conversations like the individual did with Peter on the porch, that's wonderful. And hopefully that leads to greater understanding. But again, it can't happen unless people have the courage to have those conversations, and we are willing to be open-minded enough to listen.
Robert, that's great. I think it's a great segue to our second question. But Larry, let you jump in for sure.
I would like to. I find that to be an interesting question, and what I want each of us to think about is the whole concept of a safe space, that's kind of become a trendy thing right now. And I think ultimately each of us have to decide for ourselves whether DCPC is a safe place. I will say, as an older white male, I find most spaces seem safer to me. I suspect that if I was a Black, trans, queer person, I know Davidson students who travel 25 miles to go to church because DCPC may not necessarily seem like a safe place to them. I would also say this, I would also remind us of this. Jesus said a lot of radical things, and the space in which he said them did not turn out to be very safe, or he wouldn't have ended up on a cross and dead. And yet he said them. And I'm not sure when he said those things, he said to himself, well, is it safe for me to say that here? I think I go back to the statement of faith. In a broken and fearful world, the Spirit gives us courage. So I would say to any of us, say what you believe and let trust God that God is with you and that the space will be safe. And if it's not safe, then maybe that's part of what God is calling us to be unsafe. It's not about comfort. It never has been. It wasn't for Jesus.
Thanks, Larry. So as we think about all those insights you've had on that question, I think the next question kind of builds on it, which is, how have you been able to have conversations about an issue without it becoming, really politicized, right, or framed in, kind of very binary thinking, liberal, conservative, whatever. I think we touched on this a little bit last time, but I wanted to give you all a chance to follow up if you'd like. Claire.
Yeah, I'll kind of tell a story about an experience that I had. I was actually sitting on the Gwen Appleyard patio having a conversation with someone, and we clearly disagreed on what the 2020 church is to do about the slavery of America's foundations. And we disagreed we had really different opinions there. And this was all as Davidson was starting up their task force to look at the college's relationship to slavery and therefore the church's relationship to slavery. And we had a great conversation. It was not at all combative. And I think looking back on it, one of the ways that I think we had such a great conversation is that we focused on faith. And it was, how does our faith lead us to think about this issue and where we are now? And how does our faith in God now and the way that the church is the body of Christ now? So it wasn't well, Nancy Pelosi says this, and, it wasn't here are these different political leaders' approaches to dealing with the reparations or whatever, we didn't even talk about that word. It was more like, I am try my best to be a follower of Christ, and using the scriptures as a lens and what I know about God's love and God's grace. How do I look at this issue through a lens of faith, through a lens of scripture, to come to what I think is the most faithful understanding with the Holy Spirit working in my heart.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, that's great. Peter?
Yeah, Graham, I this may not work in every circumstance, but with some issues, perhaps similar to what Claire just mentioned, I try not to talk about people, try and talk about the issue. And in talking about the issue, sometimes it really helps to better understand the other person's story. I mean, I really come to believe, especially about topics that bring out a lot of passion from people, that politics are personal. There's something in that person's life and that person's experience or the experience of someone they love that's led them to this particular kind of passion. So I think number one, try not to focus on the figurehead people that may somehow be the problem child or poster child, but to talk about the issue. But in talking about the issue, I try and better understand where the other person's coming from. And so it's always helpful to ask questions before beginning to make statements. I mean, as a pastor, I find that because sometimes, like for instance, a slight analogy, when someone comes to talk to you about something, a spiritual issue, I may think I know what's going on. And then about 35 minutes later, after I've asked some questions and let them really talk, I realize that what I thought was the issue at about 5 minutes in was not the issue. There's something else going on. So I think don't talk about the people at the top, talk about the issue. And in talking about the issue, ask questions before making any statements. And I think that can help the depoliticize. It's helped me at times.
Great, thanks, Peter. Yeah, that resonates with, I think, some of the things I'm going to mention later, the idea of asking questions in particular. So if there's no other kind of comments on that question, I want to turn to our third and final kind of question, which is a little more extended. And some of you might remember from our last conversation, our last forum, that I mentioned that maybe one of you had brought up the concept of loving the sinner and hating the sin, and wondered whether, despite its misuse at times, whether it was a helpful approach to resolving the question of how to stay in relationship with someone who you deeply disagree with, or if they're supporting a candidate who you believe is deeply problematic. And a couple of our audience members last time took issue with the use of this phrase, and reminded us that it can be one of the most painful statements for members of the LGBTQ community. And so I first just wanted to say that I don't think any of you meant to offend anyone by bringing up this term. And I'm sorry if I did so. And this is a really good example of how difficult conversations can go awry. Language can mean and evoke different things to different people. And it is important as a speaker to be sensitive to those diverse understandings, and as a listener to be open to understanding where a speaker is coming from. And then for both to express a kind of their own perspectives on it and try to come to some common understanding, as maybe we are trying to do imperfectly here. So in this context, the phrase dates back to at least Augustine and is most recently associated actually with Gandhi. And yet it has been used specifically and often politically, and some might say weaponized, in debates over homosexuality and gay marriage. And so my question for all of you is, given this history, is the underlying concept worth rescuing and rehabilitating, or is it problematic at its core? And to frame this question a little more, because I think is actually very central to the connection between faith and politics that we're talking about, I'd like to share a couple clips from an interview between Cornel West and Robert George, not only because of the nature of their relationship, but also some of the insights they share in this discussion. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this will work. And this is from, let's see, get up here, Firing Line on PBS. Can everyone see my screen? John, can you nod your head?
Yes.
Okay, great. So here we go.
Conservative Christian thinker, but they are friends, teach together, and even travel the country making the point that opposites don't have to be enemies.
I love this brother, and love is not reducible to politics.
With so many fault lines in the country deepening, what do Cornel West and Robert George say now?
Firing Line with Margaret Hoover is made possible by the Margaret and Daniel Loeb Foundation, Robert Graneri through the Vanguard Donor Advised Fund, the David Tepper Charitable Foundation, Inc. Additional funding is provided by corporate funding is provided by Stevens, Inc.
Okay, I'm going to skip ahead.
Welcome back.
So did everyone get that they, Cornel West is pretty liberal.
Cornel, I know where.
And Robert George is very conservative, and yet they have this very close relationship. Actually, did it fast forward? Larry, did you hear all of that just now?
Yes.
Okay, because I can't actually hear the dialogue.
Which
It's so lovable.
And I'm so glad you guys went to lunch first.
It's true. In fact, actually, I think it's deeper than civility, and it's even deeper than respect. I think we've got a genuine love for one another. I love this brother. I revel in his humanity. We spend good time together. And so we just always want to send a sign to the nation that deep down in your heart, you know love is not reducible to politics.
Well, I not only love Cornel, I admire him, and I admire him for those virtues, for honesty and for integrity. He sets an example for me. To me, we may disagree about politics. My integrity, a person who says what he means what he says, who does not succumb to peer group pressure. Cornel's been under pressure from the progressive side sometimes to do things or say things that he actually doesn't agree with, and he refuses to yield. I try to do that on my end, and I look to him as a model for that.
And so the viewers know you both did that in 2016, where you refused to support Hillary Clinton, even there was enormous pressure from you on the Democratic side to support Hillary Clinton, and for you as well, Dr. George, to support President Trump and to vote for him and to throw your weight behind him. So both of you have really walked that walk. Dr. George, you've said of Dr. West, Cornel is someone I have been learning from since the moment we met. Even if I thought he was getting the answer wrong, I noticed he was always asking exactly the right question. Can you give me an example?
Pause it there and actually fast forward again to a little later in the conversation. And I recommend this and all of their interviews together because they're great.
Powers that be within the Republican Party, but I think it's a broader affair. I think we're living not just in a highly polarized moment in the society, but it's a gangsterized moment in our society. And by
what do you mean by that?
Gangster, what I mean is the eclipse of integrity, honesty, decency. Hypocrisy is the tribute that vice plays the virtue. So when you're a hypocrite, at least you still have standards. You're just falling short. A gangster has no standards at all. And that is the most dangerous thing. No democracy can
Sounds like
survive.
you're describing President Trump.
Well, I mean, he's one example, but he's not the only gangster around. All of us have some gangster inside of us, no doubt about that. And I would say even about Brother Bloomberg. You see?
Okay, I'm going to pause there and I'm going to jump over to a different conversation they did at Baylor University. Can you all see him? This is a different screen. John, can you see? Okay, so he's going to follow up on this idea of the gangster in all of us.
And so forth. And it's so easy these days to act as if Brother Trump is somehow the cause when he's just a sign and a symptom of it. People say, why you call him a brother? Well, he made the image of God just like me. And he's got the potential to change, even though I'm not banking a political program on that. But he does have the capacity to change. And anybody who's been transformed and undergone conversion know that you changed. I've publicly on TV called him a gangster almost every time I'm on TV. And then people call me, how could you call the president a gangster? I said, because I was a gangster before I met Jesus, and now I'm a redeemed sinner with gangster proclivities. When I called him a gangster, I'm talking about something inside of me that I have to conquer day in and day out. All of that hatred, that envy, that revenge, that coldness, that numbness, that callousness, that
Okay, so stop sharing now. So I actually couldn't hear any of that. I've listened to it several times, but I take this sort of his use of first of all to sort of see their amazing relationship, and how they're able to have conversation and discussion across enormous differences, and still not only respect but love and admire each other. And I think that's an example to hold up for all of us. But secondly, this idea about gangsterism, and that we all have this gangster inside of us. That I take it as a kind of analogy or different language of sin or mistake or whichever term you want to use. And I'm curious, sort of like, how you respond. What is this a useful framing, for us thinking about, differences we have, how all of us may be wrong or have, mistaken understandings. So I'll just open it up for discussion. Peter.
Graham, I'm going to let others speak to the usefulness of the framing. I just want to go back to the original statement from last time and simply acknowledge for folks that in some ways the response to the statement is part of what we're talking about tonight, which is being able to make a stand for what you believe, but also continue in a relationship that allows both parties to move forward and even grow and learn. And so, for instance, in hearing from some of our church members about the pain that they experience from a phrase that you said, as you acknowledge, has been weaponized against the LGBTQ community, I was reminded that it's one of those phrases that probably some people think is biblical, but isn't in the Bible. That's not in the Bible in the same way that God helps those who help themselves is not in the Bible. And about some of those half-truths, Adam Hamilton, the pastor of a giant Methodist megachurch, has a great book called Half-Truths, and this is one of those. And I do know that the chair of our Social Justice Committee, Heather McKee, is certainly someone, for those who don't understand why that phrase, perhaps don't understand why that phrase can be so painful. I know that she would be able to speak to why we want to be attentive to that phrase and the pain that it causes. So in some ways, I appreciate your apology, and I appreciate the fact that that's an entry into a bigger conversation about how we live some of the things that we're talking about here today, in this 2 sessions. So I just want to say that, and then maybe if somebody else wants to speak now to the framing of what it means to acknowledge there's a gangster in all of us, even as we're trying not to give into or give permission to the gangster in the other. How about somebody else in terms of Graham's specific question?
Claire, go ahead.
Yeah, I had not seen this video, so thanks for sharing that. I have a lot of respect for both of those people, and I love seeing their friendship, and it reminds me of the friendship of Justices Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg and how they were so very polar opposite on their rulings and on their opinions, but were genuinely really good friends. I think, speaking as a white woman, I would not be comfortable using the phrase gangster because it feels like cultural appropriation to me. But the idea behind it, I really appreciate. And I think that what Dr. West was, especially in the second video, what he demonstrated was in naming what he sees as gangster tendencies in our president. He also recognizes that he has those gangster tendencies in himself, Dr. West does. And I think that's one of the reasons that this hate the sin, love the sinner, the phrase has been weaponized. The idea behind it, I think, is this idea of mutual forbearance. But the phrase itself has been weaponized, I think, because it doesn't leave room for that humility. It has turned into a phrase of self-righteousness, of, identifying sins in others without also having to identify that brokenness in ourselves, which is what Dr. West was able to demonstrate. And I think that was a beautiful example. So thanks for sharing it.
Yeah, I think the phrase is too often used as in all cases about sin. We love to talk about the sin of others. And when in reality, perhaps we need to look at that statement. Loving the sinner is loving ourselves and hating the sin that we commit every day. We don't think of it in those terms, and therefore, I don't like the phrase. I think we should toss it aside, maybe forever. I don't think it's very helpful, and particularly because it has been used against the LGBTQ community. I've never heard that phrase used to describe the older white guy who's been accused of harassing women. Nobody ever says that then, but they use it when this other issue comes up. And in the case of the sexual harassment, it's actually a sin that we're talking about. So I don't think it's helpful. And again, I would agree. Look at ourselves. We're all sinners. And, it goes back to Paul. We all do the things we don't want to do. And yet we somehow end up doing them. It's unfortunate. Start with the love of the sin within you, not the sin, hate the sin within you, and love the person that God still loves despite the sin.
Great, thank you for that, Larry, and thanks, Claire and Peter as well. So if we don't have any comments from others on any of these questions, we can move to our kind of next stage phase of our conversation tonight. And I had mentioned that you all had asked me to kind of share some insights from the work that we've been doing at the Deliberative Citizenship Initiative. And our logo is this compass, because we really see this initiative as an effort to help people navigate, through the polarization that is all around us. We're not providing, answers on any of the sort of specific issues or topics, but tools and ideas for how to engage productively and to create those spaces where we can do so in collaboration with many other groups and organizations, both on campus and off campus. So towards the end, maybe we can talk a little bit about potential areas of collaboration moving forward. But first, I'm going to share my screen again. So what I like to do is talk about both things that we can do as individuals and then as a community, perhaps. In the first context, as individuals, I'm actually going to, this is a sort of world premiere release, of a document that we've been working on called the DCI Guide to One-on-One Conversations. It's actually available on our website, which, and I'm going to show it to you, but then I'm going to kind of walk you through some slides that share its main kind of ideas. So let me just jump over to this real quick. So, so here's the guide itself, and it's got different sections on before a conversation, during your conversation, after your conversation, and it's got a lot of just background, which I'm going to kind of give you an overview right now. It's available on our website. Deliberativecitizenship.org, and we'll post a link at the end. So the first thing is, if you're inspired after this forum to reach out to someone that you really want to connect with, the first question is who you're going to do that with, right? And finding someone who you do disagree with, but is someone you can trust, that will engage with you in good faith, that they value your relationship and they want to try to kind of bridge the gap that may have come between you. And then along those lines, try to avoid maybe the hardest conversation first, the person who's truly the polar opposite, and have some practice, with someone who you disagree with, but you feel confident you can have a conversation with, and then get better at it over time. And then the next question is, what will you talk about? And there's a balance here as well, like suggesting something that you do disagree with them about, that's come up maybe in a conversation over Thanksgiving or you saw on social media, but not perhaps something that is really activating for you or them, or is a really kind of raw issue for you. Maybe down the line, but maybe not the first conversation you have. And then how will you talk about it? So there's an open question here, right? You want to think about, is your relationship with them conducive to a more kind of informal conversation that, doesn't require much structure, or, it might benefit from a little more structure. And so we've got kind of tools for both of those. So for a structured conversation, there's an organization called Living Room conversations, then they have a whole bunch of guides, which I'll share later, and some, good ones to start with, that walk you through a process, and very, very easy. Usually they're used in groups, like 4 to 7 people, but we think that it's, actually conducive to just a one-on-one conversation as well. It won't take as long, and maybe that's good. And then the next question, how will you contact them? Okay, you got your topic, you got your person you want to reach out to. How do you reach out to them? Well, in this guide, we've actually drafted some emails that you can adapt for this purpose, and just send them an email and suggest a topic, a time, a date, location, either online like we're doing now, or in a socially distanced way, and then put it in their court, and if they respond, that's great. If not, give them some time, and think about reaching out to someone else. The next and last part of it is, how will you set expectations for the conversation? So the first is to focus on the opportunity to learn, to truly learn, and to share, and not to expect to change their opinions or their beliefs in one conversation. Both of you are intelligent and thoughtful people, and it's unlikely you're going to just, it's going to, ray of light's going to come down and you're going to be enlightened, or they're going to be enlightened. And also don't be surprised if you disagree on some basic facts, or you just don't understand their logic. Like, why do you think that that might happen? And you can just ask some, questions, about that. And I'll come to that more in a second. And then just realize that this takes time. Investing in relationships, and this kind of understanding takes time, and it may not happen in one conversation again. And then they write back and say, yeah, let's do it. And so you can follow a living room conversation guide that walks you through a process, or you can do a more unstructured conversation. And I've got some tips on how to do this in the next few slides. And these are all, again, in the DCI 101 guide that you can look at later. So how you set the tone of the conversation. So we have what we call a kind of list of deliberative dispositions that we've developed as part of the DCI, that we think are really helpful to, making these kind of discussions, these kind of dialogues more productive, more rewarding. And these are just a few of those. So one is just projecting open-mindedness and curiosity, just wanting to understand, and being curious about where they're coming from. Being compassionate and charitable, giving them the benefit of the doubt. Again, when they say something that maybe is offensive, try to just probe where they're coming from, rather than necessarily jumping to a conclusion about why they think what they think. Having a sense of anticipation, so particularly on your end, that you might learn something new, right, and have some new ideas come your way, and anticipating that, being excited about that rather than resisting it. And encouraging an emphasis on evidence, kind of broadly defined, right? So that includes, real, like, facts and figures, but also experiences and stories, and just descriptions of an issue that maybe you might help your partner understand where you're coming from, and that might help you understand where they're coming from. And then the idea of shifting, and this comes from David Compt, who is often known as the dialogue guy, shift from looking for what is wrong with what they're saying to maybe what is right with what they're saying, and focus less on facts and figures, and more on stories, more on experiences that inform where you both are coming from. And then again, this idea of being intellectually humble, and Robert George and Cornel West talk about this a lot. That realize that you may be wrong, right? You may, you don't know what part of your ideas are wrong, but probably some of your ideas are wrong somewhere. And so having that humility to be open to that possibility, and that's certainly what I think we try to do. At Davidson, is encourage that intellectual humility, and then coupled with a kind of intellectual confidence that you also, you do know something and you have thought about things, and striking that balance between, a kind of confidence and humility. So then, you set the tone with those dispositions. How do you engage with your conversation partner? The first is, and Peter mentioned it earlier, just, listening, right? Actively listening, nodding, physically nodding your head, and, body language, showing that you really are interested in what they're talking about. And there's a lot of different strategies.
I just spotlighted you.
Okay.
Grant.
Okay, good. Yeah. So hopefully that works. Can people still see this, the slides though?
Oh no, your slides are gone.
Okay. I think they'd rather see the
You haven't
slides
had
than me.
slides.
Oh, you haven't had this?
No,
Oh dear. What have you been having?
just you.
A lot of great tips from you.
Wow. Okay. Can you see the slides now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So interesting. Okay. Well, here we are. Now you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, good. So, so asking good questions is the next thing after, actively listening, and it's part of actively listening. And these come from a platform called Open Mind, 5 W questions. Who in your life has the most, impact on the way you think about this issue? What life experience might have led you to develop this view, right? Where do you see this issue playing out in your life, in your own life? When do you think your view applies? Are there exceptions, right? And then finally, why is this issue so important to you? And again, tone matters a lot, right? Like you can ask this in a very sarcastic way or a very, kind of considerate way. And then sharing, once it comes to your turn to talk, to share honestly and respectfully with your partner. So where you're coming from politically, using I statements, helps soften things like, President X is whatever, right? No, I think President X is whatever, tends to soften the conversation a little bit. And then identifying areas of similarity and agreement can help as well. And then when you actually do disagree, don't necessarily shy away from it, but soften it a little bit, project, I hear you on that, but, I think I'm going to disagree, a little bit, and then explain why. And then try to use language, yes, and, instead of yes, but, like always that but can, kind of charge a conversation. And then when things get rough, that you get emotional, they get emotional, acknowledge that emotion, and say, I'm, this is a really important issue to me. And sometimes you get emotional about it, apologize in advance, but, this really bothers me about X issue. And then, try to focus on values rather than positions, that those, where are they coming from? I think you really are concerned about equality here. Is that right? I really think you're concerned about freedom and liberty here. Is that right? And then you can often find common ground that way, when you talk more about values themselves. Practice pausing. Now, this is an idea also from social psychologists that, we, a lot of our reactions to things are from our kind of our unconscious, our system 1 thinking, our emotions, and sometimes, our conscience, our conscious thinking steps in, but they're just like a little rider on an elephant, and the challenge here is, to pause and try to, kind of take control, at least for a moment, of those emotions when they well up, you get really, agitated, or they get really agitated, just taking a pause, still expressing the emotion, but maybe not, in a way that you might regret later. And then remembering the goal, right? The goal is to connect, right? And to learn and to reestablish the relationship so that you can learn from one another. And then finally showing grace, right? Recognizing that, you're both are there in good faith, to try to understand, to giving them the benefit of the doubt as best you can. And so those are just some tips, on hosting having those conversations. And then, once you've had it, I think most people who do this, really find it rewarding and helpful. And you can follow up. You can thank them, note areas of agreement or commonality, and then suggest doing it again, on a different topic, or following up later on what you've just talked about. So those are some tips on one-on-one conversations. There's a whole lot more out there. These are all listed in the one-on-one guide on the last page. Braver Angels, Open Minds, some articles in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and a book. Actually, this is recommended by Robert. I Think You're Wrong, but I'm Listening, a guide to grace-filled political conversations. I haven't read it, but I just ordered it. I want to read it because it sounds really interesting. And so I recommend all these as further resources on that one-on-one kind of as individuals. How do we build bridges more with people we care about? So the next kind of topic was on just as a community, what we can do, the church, broadly, as the Presbyterian Church, but also as DCPC specifically. So here's just some ideas, to think about. What can DCPC do as a community to foster these difficult but important conversations? The first is to kind of just learn about the large and growing deliberative democracy movement. It's been growing since about the early 90s, and it's really taken off in the last 5 years. And to the extent that you do engage, in these efforts of dialogue and deliberation, you're part of something bigger that is across the country and around the world, actually, where a lot of people are frustrated, with the polarization that we're seeing among our politicians, and want to, forge better relationships, reweave our social fabric, as one project calls it. And so that, this is hard and it's challenging, but many people are doing it and doing it successfully. The second is to check out resources from Baylor University's Faith and Deliberation Initiative. They've got a lot of great issue guides, and I think I got a little slide here. Yeah, so deliberative liturgies. They have a whole network of faith-based communities that are doing this work, and so that is a good resource for religious communities in particular. Then also the National Institute for Civil Discourse has this new Golden Rule 2020 initiative, which is centered around this pledge that people commit to practice the Golden Rule and treat others with respect and dignity in their political discourse and behavior. During the 2020 campaign season, but after as well. And it's really based in a kind of faith orientation. It's very interfaith. It's a very interfaith initiative, and I encourage all of you to check it out and use some of its resources. And then finally, the possibility of collaborating with us at Davidson and the Deliberative Citizenship Initiative. We really see ourselves as a kind of resource for groups on campus and off campus that want to do this kind of thing. We can help plan things, design, train facilitators, and co-host events and activities. So thought I'd say a few more words about the DCI. So this is our objective, right? To create these spaces for people to productively engage with one another on difficult topics. We're trying to teach deliberative skills, reinforce humane instincts. Those of you who know Davidson, that's in our statement of purpose. Build meaningful community. That for me, community means people are committed to each other in achieving some common goal, some collective action, and we're trying to support that as much as we can. Proposing creative solutions. Talk is important. It's foundational to democracy, but can you guys hold on 1 second? My battery's running low. Okay, sorry about that. I thought I had more batteries than I did. So the next is proposing creative solutions. So talk is important, foundational to a healthy democracy, but it also needs to come up ultimately with some creative solutions. And so we're working on that as well, having a kind of action orientation. And then also research component. So analyzing deliberations and dialogues and seeing what works, what doesn't, and implementing new ideas, new strategies for making them work better. And so we're doing things on campus, in the curriculum, in the community, and also, as I said, in research context. And we've got, we're hosting guest lectures and workshops. We actually have one this week, starting on Wednesday. Martine Carcason, who's a kind of world renowned expert in deliberation, is coming to Davidson virtually. He'll be doing a guest lecture on Wednesday night. And then we're doing a series of workshops on Thursday and Friday that you are all welcome to attend. There's some more oriented towards students or faculty and staff or community members, but you're all welcome to attend. And we'll post the link to it in the chat where you can register. We have deliberative citizenship and fellows right now that are trained as facilitators, and they're actually facilitating some deliberative, what we call D teams, small groups of 4 to 7 people. Actually, John and Peter are in 2 of them right now, and we're kind of experimenting with this approach to deliberation, small scale, iterative. So they meet every 2 weeks and talk about different topics that are of interest to them. And then finally, deliberative forums. And we have one coming up on October 21st on voting. How can we safeguard and improve our elections? And again, you are all welcome to attend. We'll also break up into small groups from that in that larger Zoom meeting. And those will be facilitated discussions by our fellows, by trained and certified facilitators. So encourage anyone and everyone to come and attend those and talk about voting. And then we'll be doing one again in November as well. So I think that's just about, that was just, so collaborative opportunities, just to throw some out there. And then I want to open it up for questions and answers from all of us. So we could, do small group experiences like D teams for DCPC members. We could help train church members and how to facilitate these conversations. These teams could focus on issues that of interest to the church and or to kind of faith considerations more generally. And Baylor University has a couple great kind of issue guides to start as starting points for that potentially. We could organize some deliberative forums. And so I've actually got a link. If anyone is interested in getting involved in any way, I'll put that in the chat box as well and we'll put it on YouTube also. And then we can follow up with you as we develop ideas. I've talked a little bit with John and Peter about some of these ideas, but it really depends on the community if people are interested in doing this, in doing any of these options. So I think I'm going to stop there. Yeah. And open it up to questions. I think Glenette has been collecting questions, but also pastors, if you have questions about what I've just gone through, try to make it quick so we have time for more conversation.
Well, we have only had one question. It came in from YouTube very early in this session. The question was, how should I, as a Christian, interact with other Christians who see no problem with or even root for a president who has called his actions perfect? who has called himself the chosen one as he gestures toward heaven, and who has declared himself immune to a disease that has killed over 214,000 Americans and 1 million worldwide.
So who'd like to take that one?
I think Robert should answer that question.
Actually, I am going to answer that question. This last week when we were talking, or maybe it was week before last, among some of the pastors, John Ryan and I remembered a course that we took many moons ago at the Presbyterian School of Christian Education with noted Professor Gwen Hawley, wonderful woman, God rest her soul. She taught us about a resource in social psychology known as the awareness wheel. And I probably am not allowed to share my screen, am I?
I think you can actually.
Yeah, you can.
All right, well, let me see if I can pull up a brief view of that. So the awareness wheel is a means of having a conversation. Graham talked about using I statements, and what it does is it allows you to have a conversation, owning your own feelings and thoughts about a particular incident. And I don't know if this is helpful to people or not, but I think the only way you can have some of these conversations, if first you have to decide, is this worth it? And I think a lot of challenges that people face today is that they decide, no, it's not. This is not worth my time or my energy to try to help this conversation continue. But sometimes you don't have a choice in a way, because the relationship is important and you want to salvage it or help it to grow. So the awareness wheel allows you to be honest with what you see. So if you notice somebody speaking in a way about something, you simply say, I see you speaking this way, or I hear what you're saying, and this is how I feel about this. And this is why I feel this way. This is what I think about what you've said or done. And my reaction to that is that you can describe what's going on inside of you just in honest terms, not in judgmental terms, but just be honest about your own reaction to that. And then if you have a request, then you can make that, and you can move on to an action step of either deciding that that's not something you can talk about, which some people have done, or deciding to have a conversation in a helpful, constructive way using the process similar or like what Graham described, or something else. But this wheel gives us a way to own where we are with statements while trying not to be judgmental, while trying not to demonize someone, while trying to focus on your observation and reaction. And maybe in the process of describing this, you may find that what was said or spoken about wasn't what was intended at all. For example, with the comment from earlier, not that I'm trying to promote hate the sin, love the sinner, but if somebody said that to you, this could be a process you could go through to share with them how troubling that might be to you. And your request might be, please don't use that anymore, for example. Anyway, just a thought. I found it helpful, and I continue to use this almost 30 years later.
Any other thoughts on that one?
One of the Larry's going to talk. I just want to mention one thing, which is, at the very beginning of your suggesting, setting the tone, and in that whole section, it presumes that we're treating the other person as a person, that they're not an opinion to be changed, they're not an object to be moved, but they're a person with whom we are called to be engaged. And if we view them that way, it hopefully brings some of that humility about which we're speaking, the curiosity about which we've been speaking. So, I mean, I just think a fundamental element to all of this is, what is your view of the other person? And if your view is that they're not as smart as you, as good as you, or they're just an opinion to be swayed, that'll affect what we do and how the conversation goes. Or if we treat them as a fellow child of God, from whom we want to learn, with whom we want to be open, with whom there's a relationship we're pursuing, I think that will affect how we approach it. And we need to be mindful, as you did, which conversation with which person where. Like, I'm not, some of the things we're talking about aren't what you're going to bring to the casual conversation in the street corner where someone just kind of rubs you the wrong way. That's something different than your parent with whom you have a fundamental disagreement, or your neighbor who you see every day taking out the trash, or your child, or whatever. I mean, we all get the point, but how do we view the other person is an important piece. Sorry, Larry.
All of this, to me, is a different discussion in October of 2020 than it has been historically. If all people were like Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg or Robert George and Cornel West, this would be an easier conversation to have. If we could respect one another with what did Graham say? Intellectual humility and intellectual confidence, that's great. But that is not the really experience that I'm having right now when I watch our two presidential candidates, whatever that was. There was very little intellectual humility and intellectual confidence in that, whatever that was a few weeks ago. So to me, this conversation is harder right now. Graham, I completely applaud your work, and I hope there is great success in it. But I also would say to all of us, we have to recognize that right now there's going to be some tension. Feelings have been heightened, things have been said, and we need to be a little bit comfortable in that tension and not expect everything to be hunky-dory right now. It's not going to be when feelings are this heightened. This is another favorite thing of mine, is the letter from the Birmingham jail from Martin Luther King. And these words really speak to me. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom. I think we have to have some comfort level with the fact that we feel tension with one another, and be okay with that.
Well, and Larry, I don't think anything we've said is dissuading the fact that there's going to be some tension, and that we have to be comfortable. I mean, in some ways, everything Graham talked about presumes that you're talking with someone with whom you disagree. There's tension, and that you may walk away still disagreeing. There's tension. I mean, nobody's saying that we're trying to pretend like there's no tension out there.
I understand.
Yeah.
And it is a real struggle, all of this. And I completely think Centers for Diversity and Inclusion, deliberative citizenship should be out there in the forefront. I think we all would benefit from this. I got active listening training in my corporate life in the 80s. And I think it is a great skill to use to this day.
Robert, go ahead.
The other, you mentioned the time that we're in, and it's not just that it's 2020, but it's that it's less than a month before the election. And it's hard to have a conversation with somebody on the other, quote unquote, the other side that isn't trying to sway you to vote differently because there are such high stakes right now. And so maybe some of these conversations are better to have later. I don't know.
Well, and And Robert, it's not just that it's near the election. And Claire, I would love to get your input on this. I mean, so much of Claire's job right now, and probably even more so than some of us, is by Zoom and online. And that's another element. So we're talking about having conversations with whom with people we disagree. And a certain amount of those, like someone sharing something through the Zoom conversation in Sunday school or in the Zoom Bible study. And Claire, I mean, knowing that you do so much right now of the campus ministry online, like what have you learned about the way that the fact that it's me talking through the screen to you, how that impacts how you've seen the conversations work and go well or go awry? I'm curious.
Yeah, it's a lot harder. And I think one of the things that cannot happen right now, which did happen in 2016, for better or for worse, is that casual conversation with someone you're walking with or someone you're having dinner with or you see in the grocery store, and that maybe there's fruit there for either a more casual conversation or something more intentional, like Graham was pointing out. And now it's got to be these, scheduled Zoom meetings. And I found, especially with the students, the first year students who haven't known as much, it's harder to establish rapport and a trust when there's a screen, because it just is. There, you lose a sense of intimacy when we're not physically together, person to person. It adds an extra layer of challenge on, but at the same time, provides more opportunities for me to connect with a student who's currently in Oregon and a student who's in Michigan, and added challenges and added blessings. Isn't that kind of the task of each new day?
Yeah, those are all great, great thoughts. There is another question that I think we can go to, but I just wanted to follow up on one or two things. So just to Larry's point, about having that prophetic voice himself, right? Like that. We talk about deliberative citizenship. Deliberative citizenship is just one form of citizenship. There are many other forms, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? You can deliberate and you can protest. You can vote and you can dialogue, right? You can do these things, either sequentially or some even simultaneously. And I think, and there's a time, sort of a time for peace and a time for war. There's a time for deliberating. There's a time for kind of getting out there and getting out the vote, for example. And Robert, as Robert says, like now for many of the time is that, right? Is that GOTV, right? But there's also a kind of balance that I think our society needs, and that goes in terms of forms of citizenship. It also goes to calls for, justice, right? Everyone has kind of their own various forms of justice that they're looking for. And I think this is a good segue to the next question, which Glenette, would you like to read?
Sure. For members of marginalized communities, issues framed by the dominant caste as differences of political opinion are matters of life and death. How do we take seriously the lived experience of oppressed people and encourage the transformative and liberative grace of God?
Claire, you want to jump in?
Sure, yeah. Many of y'all know that I've started a graduate program, another graduate program out in the real world at Clemson University. And I just did a project on what's called critical race theory, which started as a way to kind of analyze our nation's laws and examine institutional racism, but it's kind of been expanded out and out and out to be a bigger paradigm framework for kind of analyzing systems. And two things in that critical race theory, I think, are really important in addressing this really good question. And one, Robert did that really great wheel. I forget what you call it, Robert, the wheel of awareness. And at the top was noticing. And I would love there to be an asterisk of one of the things that we notice is where the power is. because as a white person, I hold a lot of power, and if I'm having a conversation with a person of color, then there's a power imbalance there. And I think when there is a power imbalance, that's another cue as to who gets to do more talking and who is able to do more listening. So one of the other things of critical race theory, one of the 7 essential tenets, is the power of storytelling, which basically means the people who represent the power, the oppressive or powerful party, we need to be quiet and allow space and allow voice to people who do represent these marginalized, oppressed peoples. And I think Robert was the one who said that we all have our blind spots and it's hard to tell where our own blind spots are. And one of the ways we do that is by acknowledging where we hold the power, and then to be quiet and to listen to people as they tell their stories.
Any other thoughts on that question?
Graham, I would just say, I mean, amen to what Claire said. And of course, the problem for a lot of us is our religious networks, our professional networks, our personal networks are pretty monochromatic. And so we don't even know the stories because we don't know people with alternative stories to the ones that we think are that are the dominant ones that we don't realize are dominant, that we just assume they're the story. The problem is we don't know people with alternatives. And I say that as the pastor of a church that's 99.8% white and a denomination that's 93% white. That's part of the problem with hearing the stories. We don't have the connections, some of us.
Claire?
And I'll just add on to that too. Yeah, that's a really great point, Peter. And for those of us who were able to attend the Ibram X. Kendi lecture, the Reynolds lecture at the college, that was one of the questions that a student posed to Dr. Kendi. Like, when we live in a monochromatic world, college, in a workplace, church, whatever that context is, how do we get to hear those stories? And he said, read. There are things out there available to read that people have thoughtfully written and published. And so to recognize those blind spots, one way we can do that is to read.
On behalf of social media, I actually think one way you can do that is reading the social media posts of marginalized people and communities. I think it's eye-opening to all of us and a way to get away from our monochromatic worlds. So social media can be a benefit if we open ourselves to other viewpoints.
And I'm going to put something out there. Just, one of the things we encourage our facilitators in our training is to sometimes be the devil's advocate, and put out ideas that maybe aren't represented in the panel. I very much hear Claire's example, and reference to critical race theory, and yet I'm also aware that for some people, that term, particularly now that the president has focused on it, but even before then, is activating, is traumatizing even, and that even if we're monochromatic in some ways, like the experiences of all white people are not the same, right? And that they can experience things that DCPC, your average DCPC member doesn't, right, or doesn't see, right? The same way we don't experience, what communities of color or people of color experience. And so if we're going to be serious about engaging with difference, right, we have to engage with those differences as well. And doing it in, as the framing, and as engaged Christians or engaged people of faith, we're kind of about at time, but I want to leave with another example of a dialogue that I really benefited from watching, which was between Arthur Brooks and Danielle Allen. Danielle Allen is an African-American scholar, political theorist at Harvard University, and so is Arthur Brooks, but he used to be the president of the American Enterprise Institute, pretty conservative. And they were having this really interesting conversation at the Kennedy School. And Arthur Brooks, it was a very civil discussion, and they're both very, smart intellectuals. Arthur Brooks was making a point about, we're not all going to, just sit down and sing Kumbaya together. We're going to, the same kind of point about, Krista Tippett and muscular civility, right? We're not, and that was kind of what the point he was trying to make. But Danielle Allen, kind of paused, right? And, said, Arthur, I don't remember the exact words, you guys can watch, but she actually had Kumbaya ready and to play, and she played the first recording of it, this African-American spiritual from probably over 100 years ago now, and talked about how meaningful that song is to her and her community, and she doesn't like how it's used in a kind of derogatory sense. That singing Kumbaya is a wonderful thing, and it should not be used in the negative. But she said it in a way that was very respectful and effective. And Arthur Brooks, credit to him, he said, yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way. I'll try not to use it in a derogatory way. And I, since then, I've also not, done so. And so it's those kind of conversations where you do learn, you share, and you can have an effect, but if you try too hard, and this is another thing that David Cobb said, it's kind of like Zen. If you try too hard, you're not going to be able to do it. You're not going to be effective. You try to touch the butterfly, it's going to fly away. But if you're not trying, and you're just having that conversation, both you and your partner, who you have vast differences with, on understandings of justice and liberty and equality and values, at the end of the day, you might actually find some common ground, even if not in the conversation, afterwards. So I leave, I guess, unless anyone else has some final comments, leave us with that hopeful thought in this very, I know, divisive and stressful and anxious time, as we approach, an election that, really has historical implications. And I encourage all of you to think about, attending these events we have this week and next. I posted the links in the chat, and you can go to our website and learn about them there as well. Peter or John, do you want to, end with anything else?
Graham, John and Gwinnett may want to say something. I just want to offer a word of thanks to you in talking to each one of the pastors individually before this, and jumping on 2 staff meetings with us in preparation, plus the actual panel and the clear preparation you did ahead of time. You've been very generous with your time and with us and with our congregation. So on behalf of the congregation and behalf of the pastors, thank you for your part in this.
Well, thank you all. And, I really see this as a partnership, as a collaboration, and trying to figure, as Larry said several times, really hard, really complex, challenging questions that I, for one, trying to be humble, don't know that I don't have all the answers. And it's only through these kind of conversations, and sometimes, as Larry also said, uncomfortable ones, that we come closer to a better answer. So thank you all for doing this and allowing me to have these conversations with each of you and all of you.
Thank you. John and Gwinnett, any wrap up from the adult faith formation folks before Graham kicks us off the call?
Thank you for your participation.
Yes, I would echo that. Thank you very much to all the pastors and to you, Graham. It's been wonderful.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.